So usually at events like this, the officials, when they make their statements, they tend to be very diplomatic, and it's the academics who are provocative. But I think after this today's very provocative opening statements, you've set the bar very high for the rest of us. So it gives me enormous pleasure to chair this panel on geopolitics and to introduce these three very distinguished speakers. Before I introduce them, however, I would like to say a few brief words about what we'll be covering on this panel. I suppose if I could sum it up in a sentence or two, we'll be examining where the EU and the US agree and disagree in their analysis of China's foreign and security policy, and what are the implications for their own policies. Are we speaking about an adversarial relationship, a strategic rivalry, or a strategic competition? And what are the prospects for cooperation and potentially partnership? Can we have both simultaneously, or are they mutually exclusive? How are the EU and US navigating this complex terrain? What are the similarities and differences in their approaches? Where are we today, and what direction are we headed? What will be the key drivers of change, or are we, perhaps, condemned to some variation of the status quo? Naturally, of course, this covers a great deal of ground, everything from the war in Ukraine, China's relationship with Russia, relations in the Indo-Pacific, especially with Taiwan and in the South China Sea. There's China's growing nuclear arsenal, China's role in the Middle East, climate change, human rights, AI, and so forth. Lots of specific issues we can discuss, but are there any observable general trends? Are the US and China destined for war, to use Graham Allison's happy phrase? And if so, where does the EU stand? Or can we somehow get through this difficult period peacefully and get relations on a better track? And what might this look like? These are extremely complicated problems with no easy answers, but thankfully we have a really first-class group of panelists who, even if they can't provide answers, can nevertheless offer some very highly informed perspectives. Our first speaker will be Louis Simon, who is the Director of Research at the Center for Security, Diplomacy, and Strategy at the Brussels School of Governance, as well as the Director of the Brussels office of the Elcano Royal Institute. And I can say without any doubt that he is widely regarded as one of the foremost European experts on geopolitics and strategic affairs. Next we'll have Robert Daly, the Director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the US at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Robert has had a very distinguished career both in the U.S. Foreign Service as well as in academia, and is again one of the foremost experts on U.S.-China relations. Our third speaker is Sarah Kirchberger, who serves as academic director at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University. She's also head of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy and Security, also at Kiel, and is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. But leaving all those wonderful titles aside, Sarah is probably one of the most knowledgeable people on Chinese security policy there is. Each of the speakers will go for speak for about 8 minutes, and then we'll turn over right away to the questions and answers. So Louis, without further ado, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Jeff, and buona tarda a tothom. Thanks to you, Jeff, and to the organizers, the IEN, and the other organizers for the invite. So I understand I am to be diplomatic and provide no answers to any of the questions that you gave us. So I'm gonna try and touch on the question of whether Europe is a player or a playground in US-China competition, which sort of informs the European Research Council project that I'm currently leading, a 5-year project. Bottom line up front, I'm going to try to argue that Europe, and this is should be no surprise to anyone, is both a player and a playground in US-China competition, and focus on when and why one condition is more prevalent than the other. So most academic discussions on European strategic autonomy have actually focused primarily on whether Europeans are able to defend themselves against a resurgent Russia without US assistance. However, we actually have, this only seems to be of interest to academics, because we actually have very few signs of European leaders actually seeking to become autonomous from the United States or the NATO framework in that context, in that military context. And if anything, the war in Ukraine has sort of further underscored the centrality of the United States and NATO for the European security architecture. But it is actually when it comes to grappling with US-China competition that sort of evokes broader questions related to the future of global order and institutions and norms that European policymakers have actually explicitly invoked the need for greater autonomy, and we can unpack that later. For instance, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, has argued that US-China competition has become, and I'm quoting, the dominant organizing principle for global politics, and urged Europeans to follow their own path and not China's or America's path, the so-called Sinatra doctrine, my way. French President Emmanuel Macron has similarly argued that Europeans must assert their autonomy, and I'm quoting, if they are to escape a world dominated by Sino-American competition. And indeed, because of its economic, technological, and diplomatic weight, Europe is an important playground in US-China competition. And I think the United States and China have both realized that Europe's actions can have an important impact on their balance of power, and have tried to influence European policies in different areas, and of course in very different ways. In the sense that the different nature of their relationship, the respective relationship with Europeans, an alliance in the case of the former and much milder ties in the case of the latter, means that the bar for success in terms of influencing Europe is very different for the United States and China. So China's aim appears to be de-alignment, namely to get Europeans to continue to reject the frame of US-China competition and talk about multilateralism, even encourage strategic autonomy and so on. To be sure, China is not naive about its possibilities to either erode Europe's ties with the United States or match US influence in Europe, but it wants to ensure that at least the transatlantic relationship is not activated when it comes to China or East Asia and remains confined to the European region. In contrast, the United States has aimed precisely for that kind of alliance activation, i.e. to get Europeans to buy into the notion of China as a strategic competitor and align with the United States on issues ranging from trade, investment and technology, to diplomatic support on Taiwan, Hong Kong, or territorial disputes in Asia. Of course, and you tell me if I'm not doing well time-wise, huh? Of course, resource limitations make it very difficult for individual European countries to assert their autonomy in a context of great power competition. Hence the attractiveness of the European Union, right? Because in the sense that combining the resources allows Europeans to significantly close at least the raw power gap with other great powers, which is something that President Macron, again, has alluded to repeatedly. However, we know that resource mobilization, which is an expression that us academics love, as you know, Jeff, is a lot more difficult for the European Union than it is for sovereign states, right? Because the EU is hardly a cohesive political actor. It is rather a community of 27 states that share sovereignty between in different degrees and across different issue areas, right? And in fact, we see that many European countries actually have a higher political allegiance to the United States than they do to the European Union, right? Particularly in the eastern flank. So the central challenge for European strategic autonomy is therefore how to overcome disunity and bind Europeans together around common policies. And former Chancellor Merkel has alluded specifically to how speaking with one voice is a precondition for Europeans to secure their interests vis-a-vis China. I think this is why the theme of this gathering is so spot on, right? Because the question of alignment is critical in the debate on Europe's role on US-China competition. And here we see that Europe's capacity to bind together in relation to China specifically has varied enormously, right? Hence the point that I was trying to make about Europe being both a player and a playground. And of course, Europe's capacity to bind together, again, no surprise, we see that it hinges primarily on the level of alignment between the EU's two dominant powers, France and Germany, on any given issue. Just a couple of examples. You're giving me the 2-minute sign. So a couple of examples from different areas: trade, technology, and security policy. So France and Germany, for instance, agreed on the need for an EU-China investment deal and not let U.S. reservations or lack of Chinese progress on questions like labor rights derail or significantly delay the deal. And they pushed together for CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, despite reservations by many other EU member states and from the United States as well. And they managed to get it through. So in the sense that a high level of Franco-German alignment and institutional centralization, the fact that the Commission was actually leading this file and was aligned with France and Germany and against other member states, made it very difficult for either China or the United States to influence European decision-making on CAI. As a result, Europe displayed a high level of unity, a high level of autonomy, right? We see a different result, for instance, on the debate on whether to ban Huawei from Europe's 5G infrastructure, right? France and Germany both perceived Huawei as a potential security risk, but disagreed on the specific measures to be applied to it, right? Germany wanted to apply technical criteria for excluding certain companies, whereas France wanted to apply both technical and political criteria. So there was a significant degree of Franco-German disagreement on this issue, which partly accounts for the fact that it was a free-for-all on the Huawei debate, and there was I would say, an intermediate level of alignment and therefore of European autonomy. I have other examples, but you're giving me that look, which is, making me uncomfortable. So I'm going to wrap it up, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to the conference. As has been mentioned, President Joe Biden and Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping met in San Francisco late last year. And this was, I think, good news for the world. They didn't solve any specific problems, but both leaders committed to resuming dialogue and to trying to lower the temperature in the relationship. Why did they do that? Their common motivation, I want to posit, is to avoid war. This is about the avoidance of war, which is, of course, a tacit recognition that the possibility of war between the United States and China, while still quite low, is going up. There are more tensions and more factors that cause both China and the United States to worry about conflict, and neither side wants it. Neither side wants conflict. That's great news. The more worrisome news coming out of San Francisco is that despite this commitment to avoiding war, there is no sign that either side has actually reconsidered its position. There's no rethink of interests, of strategies, no reassessment of our own position in the world or the position in the world of the other. And so I've been here in Barcelona for the past few days giving some university lectures about this, and I've been speaking with undergraduates saying that actually this is not just a strategic rivalry or a strategic competition, but that in fact my thesis has been the best analytic framework for understanding friction between the United States and China is that we are already involved in a new type of Cold War. Alarming as that phrase is, I think that it's the accurate framework. And I've also been suggesting that within that framework we need to focus on new arms control regimes so that there's no use of nuclear weapons. And we also need to focus on what has already been mentioned, which is global systems, which is sometimes called the global order competition. You mentioned that. It's been a very rich conversation with Spanish and international students that has taught me some things. But this has been a conversation between me and Spanish students, and today we have a conversation between you and Americans and Europeans. And so the question in my mind, having lived in China for 12 years, is, well, what would the Chinese say about all of this? I have a great many Chinese friends, and I have a pretty good sense of what they would say, and I think what they would say is this. I mentioned that it's a new Cold War, and they would start by saying, you Americans have a Cold War mentality. This is a Cold War mentality. It's easy to answer this. If it's raining outside, and I say it's raining, I do not have a rainy day mentality. I just recognize rain, right? So we have to ask, what are the facts? Where should we really be focused? But China, my Chinese friends also make some very valid points, and they ask some good questions. One of the points that my Chinese friends make is, why are you accusing China of being a bad actor internationally when China is only doing what any country in its conditions would do, and what you, the United States, have done? We are trying to translate wealth into power. We are trying to take our money and build deference. Dependence through deference is what China is going for, and that's what the United States did. Rich countries push their defensive perimeters outward. The United States has pushed its defensive perimeters outward until they comprise the entire globe. So why this demonization of China? My Chinese friends also like to say, where is it written? Who decides that you, the United States, gets to have this extraordinary power, the world's foreign exchange reserve currency, the global language, soft power, discursive power, as well as your military and economic power? This is a fair question. China is not the only country that asks it. And of course, the answer is, I think the American answer is that it isn't written. It has to be continually earned by bringing benefits to people who participate in the system and by paying real costs to try to uphold that system. My Chinese friends also say, you're accusing China of wanting to be a new hegemon. But everybody knows, 众所周知, the whole world knows. Whenever you hear this phrase, the whole world knows, the next thing said is untrue. Bear that in mind. That China is simply a developmental state whose rise benefits everyone, and that China has no strategic ambition. China in the Taiwan Strait, in the Western Pacific, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Chinese-Indian border is merely trying to reclaim its rightful territory, the claims that it has always made. So this would be part of a Chinese rebuttal here today. And then the biggest claim that we hear from Chinese interlocutors in the many discussions we have with Chinese is to the United States. This is the big one. You're just plain wrong. You, the West, Europe and the United States, have misperceived China. You're wrong. Our rise is not a challenge. It's not a threat. You are seeing this in the wrong way. You can ask the Chinese friends, why do you think we're seeing it in the wrong way? They have an answer to that. And the common phrase in China is, the East is rising and the West is declining. Xi Jinping has said it. Okay, and you've all read the data that lie behind this. The East is rising, the West is declining. You misperceive China because of your fear of decline. The United States and the West more broadly in this Chinese scheme is clinging in a desperate way, a deluded way, that is also dangerous to any last vestiges of Western or American primacy. That is the Chinese answer. So in sum, the claim I get from my Chinese friends is that China is somehow geostrategically innocent, and the West is mean. It comes down to this. Now, what does this mean? What about alignment, this question of alignment against this background? I think we've actually seen a tremendous increase in alignment over the past several years. We are largely but not completely aligned in our views toward China, although not necessarily in our strategies, not in the specifics, but in the broad views. I've actually come up with a formula for this. If I had a blackboard, I would write the formula on the board, and it goes like this. With reference to China and the China challenge, the EU now equals the US, alignment, minus America's concern with maintaining preeminence, minus America's specific interests in the Indo-Pacific, maintaining the Pax Americana, maintaining an alliance system, upholding the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, defending the global commons, the relationship with Taiwan. These are not as big concern for Europe as they are for us. So, and plus, a still deeper hope that strong commercial ties can be maintained. So this has been my experience. That's the formula. EU equals US, minus concerns for preeminence, minus specific interests in the Indo-Pacific, and with a stronger concern for commercial relations. China's foreign minister, Wang Yi, who was just here, was in France, he doesn't see it that way. He has a different view. And again, I believe in looking at Chinese views. Wang Yi, on his way out the door from France and Spain, said, there is an increasingly rational understanding of China in Europe. You're overcoming the misperception. You're gaining rationality. Good. Congratulations, Europe. You're rational. Okay, an increasingly rational understanding of China in Europe, believing that China's development conforms to the logic of history, and Europe should not fear or reject it. The European side, this is still Wang Yi, is positive about strengthening exchanges at all levels with China and enthusiastic about deepening pragmatic conversations. All sectors in Europe clearly oppose decoupling, and the wise are beginning to reflect on the risks brought about by de-risking. So that is Wang Yi after his recent trip here. So where is Europe in this? This is a question for China and the United States. I watch the papers on this every day. Today, the signs are mixed, as they're always mixed. China is sending more pandas to Spain, right? That's good. Pandas are cute, therefore China isn't a threat, right? That's how pandas work. So on the one hand, there's a sign of friendship. On the other hand, the EU, for the first time, just sanctioned Chinese companies for their support of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They haven't done that before. 3 Chinese companies were sanctioned today. So mixed messages, which I think are appropriate for very, very complicated times. I'll be happy to go into any of these subjects in more depth or to hear your questions in the discussion session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for having me and adding another country perspective to this excellent panel. So Luis is a Spaniard residing in Brussels, having 2 different, you could say, affiliations. And you are American with a strong Chinese connection in the sense of having friends in China. I'm also a sinologist based in Germany, Finnish citizen. So we have a couple of different, very contradictory identities here. And this is one of the main points I want to make. Are we talking always about Europe, China, Europe, US, or the triangle as a whole, and treating Europe as a monolithic entity almost? And I believe this is one of the key problems that we have. We do not really define what we mean by Europe. Do we mean the EU? I find that problematic. There's large chunks of Europe that are not part of the EU. For instance, Ukraine, for starters, and other countries like Norway. Then we have, of course, NATO, a different entity than the EU, as a different organizational identity, different interests. And then we have all the individual states in Europe. I think one can group them into particular clusters. That makes perhaps some sense. So we have the border states bordering Russia, the Eastern European, Northeastern European countries. They share, to a certain extent, a threat perception. We have the Western European powerhouses of the EU, France and Germany, as you said, when they're aligned, they can, how did you phrase it, Louis? They can make Europe aligned or something. The smaller countries might say they can bully everyone else into submission. That would be a different way of putting it. And sometimes the smaller countries of Europe tend to feel, I think, a little bit overridden by the big players. And they used to perceive the United Kingdom as somewhat more approachable and in line with their interests. And now it's left the European Union. So Britain would be another country in Europe that is not part of the EU, right? So we have a lot of complexity to deal with. And I encountered that problem in a project I was part of at the Atlantic Council that ran in 2000 and 2001 during the early phase of the pandemic. It was about finding transatlantic coherence in the face of the China challenge. And we published a report that we worked on in, I think, March 2021. It was called the China Plan, a transatlantic blueprint for strategic competition. So that was a team from Europe and the United States discussing all these issues that we're talking about in this panel. And it became very apparent that this divergence of perceptions across Europe, but then also across the transatlantic divide, is really the key of the problem that we're faced with. Because if you do not have the same perception of a challenge or of a threat and the same perception of what is important to achieve, how can you come up with any sort of unified strategy for dealing with it? So this will be my most important point. I believe some of these differences in perception and in priorities are down to divergences of interest. Countries that need to prepare for a Russian invasion have different security priorities and interests than countries like Spain, who rightfully probably do not fear a Russian invasion. It's just a difference of interest that is rooted in fact. But other differences of perception are not rooted so much in fact, but they can be due to ignorance of certain realities. And that, I think, regards the risk, for instance, that the United States is so concerned with about war in Asia, that might bring the United States to the very limit of its ability to deal if it came to a military confrontation with China. And many Europeans do not seem to realize how grave that risk really is, how urgent it could suddenly become, and how much it would stretch the ability of the United States to fulfill its alliance obligations in Europe, for instance, or its willingness to do so. In particular, its willingness to do so if Europeans would only render lukewarm support, right? The common perception that some European countries are free riding on the security guarantee, saving a lot of money and not ever contributing, and then also undermining American economic interests, for instance, with regard to China, is not just a myth. There is some facts supporting the notion that it is at least partly a fair accusation, I would say, in some ways particularly pertaining to Germany. So we have this problem of differences of opinion, differences of interest, and differences of perceptions, in some cases because maybe of ignorance, whether willful or accidental. And this would be one of the most important things for us to address across the alliance, I would think, to come to a common appreciation of the basic facts and then come to a basic acknowledgement of the differences of interest and what they are, and just acknowledge that they exist, and then trying to find the common ground. Now, coming maybe to the last point in terms of how to face the developing Cold War, I would agree with Robert there. I think we are indeed in such a situation. As a security policy researcher, I much prefer Cold Wars to hot wars. And I think the war in Ukraine shows you exactly what the risk is with a hot war. So if it's only the choice between the two, I'm all for the Cold War. But of course, the Cold War is not a desirable situation to be in. However, I'm a little bit pessimistic about our chances to averting this development of the world into blocks. We're seeing North Korea and Iran supplying weapons to Russia, China supplying non-lethal assistance to Russia, as far as we know, but very, very important assistance nonetheless. And the worrisome thing is the refusal to acknowledge that Russia has really violated the UN Charter with this war against a sovereign country, Ukraine. And many people tend to overlook the fact that China has a treaty with Ukraine, a friendship treaty, dating back to 2013 that was signed by Xi Jinping himself. And if you read the text of that treaty, there's a lot in there about China doing its utmost to fend off threats to the territorial integrity of the partner and so on. So China has not really lived up to the spirit of that treaty, other than not fully aligning itself with Russia. We also have the Baltic Connector incident in the Baltic Sea, where we had Russian and Chinese vessels somehow cooperating and damaging critical infrastructures in the Baltic Sea. We do not know whether Chinese state involvement was the case here, or whether it was just a Chinese flag vessel that was being used by Russia. We do not know that for sure. But it is nonetheless a very new and worrisome development. So basically, to conclude, I do believe that Europe has a role to play in this emerging competition that could develop into, if we are very unlucky, into actual war. We can maybe become something like a mitigating factor, but more probably a playground than a player. and we can maybe serve as a communication channel between these two sides, but we should not make the mistake of equidistance, because clearly, as long as China is not willing to acknowledge that the UN Charter, at the very least, is the basic thing that all countries that signed it should agree on, as long as that is not the case, and you can see very clearly they do not acknowledge that Russia violated the UN Charter, in that sense, I think China cannot be an equal partner to Europe in the sense that the United States has always been. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So normally at this stage I would exercise my right and ask some questions. However, we are falling a bit behind schedule, so in the interest of keeping to time as much as possible, I would like to turn this over to you now. We have microphones around the room, so anyone who has a question, if you could just raise your hand and identify yourself and any institutional affiliation. So here in the middle, and then over there, and then back, right in the center.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for permitting me be in this important place, in this important room, and this important discussion. As a matter of fact, I should be introduced. I am a Cuban born, and I have been experiencing what was the political of the Cuban aligning with the Soviet Union in order to avoid the influence of the United States of America. And then I see what happened here since 1971, and I can see that, for instance, in my experience, competitions will be always present. What we can be lucky is the competition in us is not using words and using only rivalry in commerce and innovation. That is, in this moment, one of, I think, the most important field where we are really faced. For instance, if we take into account the artificial intelligence is a place where is now playing a very important competition against China and United States, and European companies or European Union are really a small player for the moment being. And what I'm trying to say that in order to be a very important alliance between United States and the European Union should be a more help to try to be more forced independently, that each of the part of the alliance will be strong enough that anyone depend totally of the other one, in order that this coordination against this kind of common rival will be effective, and we don't feel like a second player. We should be a first player. Because of what we need is, for the first time, is to be more unit in the consideration of the whole country of being part of the United European Union.
Sorry, if I could just ask, as we're very short on time,
No,
is there a question?
Okay, no, the question is, you should some plan to try to more develop more strong between United States and European Union, but try to develop industry regarding technology, high technology.
I think we'll take a few questions and then let the panelists answer them. There was a question back here, I believe.
So thank you, Adriel Zina from University of Vic. I was watching the other day one of the best political analysts of America, Jon Stewart from the Daily Show. He's back now. He made a great point when he was sort of poking fun at Tucker Carlson's vacation in Moscow, that people like him, like Tucker Carlson or Donald Trump, former president, perhaps upcoming president Donald Trump, they don't see the Cold War as East versus West, as we tend to see it, but rather sort of woke versus unwoke. And in this sort of paradigm, then Russia would be an ally, and perhaps even China could be an ally. I don't know if you agree or not, or how do you see this sort of frame that, well, we could be immersed into if Donald Trump becomes president again, and, well, perhaps even other parties in Europe might also agree with?
No, very good question on the strongman mafia. And a question right in the center there.
Thank you, Miguel Medina from the Association of United Nations here in Barcelona. If there is a fourth edition of this seminar, most probably next year there will be somebody else in the White House, and the political majority in European Union may have changed. Let's say new political parties in the European Parliament, new political governance in some countries, and maybe a new strategic direction of the European Commission. Do you think that a new relation between Washington and Brussels may affect China, US, European Union triangle? Thank you.
So I think we'll start with those questions and then hopefully have a second round in a couple of minutes. So perhaps we can start with Louis and then Robert and Sarah. Any thoughts?
Thanks. You can hear me, right? Yes. So I guess the first question was about the possibility of a transatlantic alliance on industry and technology, if I got that right, against China. I think, you were asking about the likelihood of that happening, and I guess I would say it's yes. Yes. Is that likely to happen? Yes, and no. I mean, we have seen indeed, and I think that was said previously, that there has been a significant amount of convergence between the European Union and the United States on China in the last few years, linked not only to Ukraine, but even before China's handling of Hong Kong, but also of Xinjiang, and the COVID crisis and so on. And in fact, I would say that the EU's perception of China has evolved quite significantly in the last few years in a negative direction, and not necessarily because of US pressure, but because of Europeans' own realization of China's evolution. Partly as a result of that process, we've seen much greater coordination between the EU and the United States on the technological front. Having said that, we still see a significant degree of competition, healthy competition and understandable competition between the EU and the US on the industrial and technological fronts, right? We've seen that with the European responses to IRA. We've seen that also with Europe's own regulation of big US tech. So I think we are likely to continue to see divergences between the EU and the United States when it comes to technology. China as Trump's ally, I don't see that, frankly. I mean, we already have a first term that we can look at when it comes to that. As for Russia, I guess that's a more complicated question. Trump was relatively, I see a gap between the rhetoric and the actions in the first term, but I guess that's more of a question for you. He was pretty tough on Russia. We saw the DoD's budget in Europe go up. It's true that there was a shift from, let's say, from Germany to Poland and Eastern Europe in terms of defense resources and so on. But we didn't have any serious indications of Trump going soft on Russia. We'll see what happens with Trump too. I mean, a lot of people are saying that Trump was not his true self because people were holding him back and so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into that. And then the last question: a new political constellation in the United States and the European Union, right? Or will that will obviously? I mean, China's always looking out for opportunities to drive wedges, right? So obviously, if the relationship between the European Union and the U.S. is more acrimonious because of changes either in the political leadership, either in Brussels or in Washington or in both, well, China will try to take advantage of that for sure. And depending on the kind of changes that we see, and that could link back to the previous questions, right? That also internal cleavages along the woke versus strongman lines can also provide political opportunities for China to instrumentalize. I realize that's kind of vague, but let's.
Robert?
The John Stewart point is actually a pretty serious point. And I think clearly you understand that, but Putin has been successful in convincing a number of more right-wing countries. He's convinced them to accept this cartoon that American foreign policy is this crusade to spread, unholy, absolute wokeism around the world, with a special emphasis on transsexual rights. It's wokeness. It's gun laws that have everybody going around fully armed, and it's racism. And so he's got a certain number of buyers for that view of the United States. China isn't really one of them. That's not their litany of complaints against the United States. When China complains against the United States, it's that it is holding China down. It is harming China as a bully. It is containing China. It is seeking regime change in China. And it is pushing the independence of Taiwan. There are another series of criticisms against the United States, but those are the main ones. Yes, they'll take advantage of racist incidents and yet another shooting in a shopping mall or high school to attack the United States, but that's not their go-to playbook. They have another one. I do assume that if there's a change in the White House after the elections, that strategic autonomy will become the watchword in Europe. I don't think that necessarily means that Europe goes running into the arms of either Moscow or Beijing. I think that it will actually be strategic autonomy for the reason that you've already mentioned. The alignment, I said that there is strong alignment between the United States and Europe relevant to China. That's not something you've given to the United States as a favor. It's not something that we've convinced you of. It's been driven by your experience of Chinese actions harming or threatening to harm your interests. And that doesn't go away if there's a change in the White House. So that we share concerns, about China's divide and conquer tactics, about economic coercion, the whole values debate. Do we really want China as a builder of world order? We have geopolitical concerns about China, most notably Russia. But we also share concerns about espionage, treatment of data, influence operations within our communities and institutions. Trade with China, issues like market access, IPR theft, dumping of Chinese goods. We have concerns about wolf warriorism. None of that changes. So yes, more strategic autonomy, but I would not worry at this phase that would mean that Europe would shift toward a Chinese worldview. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, on that point about woke wars and cultural wars, maybe. I would like to add to what Robert just said, that actually there's a long tradition in communist and post-communist countries, so old KGB manuals, but also in China we have unrestricted warfare and such writings, where it's a principle to basically try and exploit your opponent's internal divisions in terms of psychological and information warfare. And I think this whole cultural war phenomenon has been massively exacerbated, probably by use of social media as a weapon, sort of. And I think it's fair to make that case because there have been other angles of attack apart from woke versus unwoke. There have been, for instance, this huge war about vaccines and vaccinations, where has research been done that coming from Russia in particular, there has been disinformation being spread on both sides of the discussion. So they are not trying to push one side of the argument. The idea is to push both sides against each other, ideally in equal measure, so that you have internal divisions developing, festering, and that, of course, weakens a country. And in the case of the United States, it's fair to say that this war has more and more, looking at it from the outside, been inhibiting the ability of the democratic system to come together and to build consensus around essential issues, which was possible in the past. And it has become very, very difficult. So the bipartisan divide is, in my view, is one of the scariest things about the United States right now, the inability to come together in matters of the national interest. And going further in terms of the transatlantic partnership, what I've often witnessed is attempts from American colleagues to try and educate Europeans that Russia is not really the big threat. The big threat you should be looking at is China. And I've literally been in conference with lots of Eastern Europeans, and an American eminent expert was trying to convince them, despite all the destruction in Ukraine, that Russia is not really a problem. And everyone was looking at him, so yeah, you have totally convinced me, right? And on the other hand, there are Europeans guilty of exactly the same thing and downplaying the risk of war in Taiwan, against Taiwan, of escalation in the South China Sea and so on, and claiming that there's nothing going on there, sometimes due to ignorance. And my argument would be what we need to do is we need to recognize that all these challenges are in reality interlinked. One side may be more involved in one than in the other, but they influence what happens in the other part of the world. So what happens right now in Ukraine has a direct impact on how China appreciates the risk of, for instance, risking a military conflict in Asia. It looks at what Russia is doing, how Russia is performing, how others are reacting, and that factors into the risk calculus. So we need to be aware of these interlinkages and need to consider our own actions in that context. We can play different roles across the alliance, but we need to recognize that everything we do and everything we do not do has an impact on the other side of the world. And that's the hard thing. And for that, the woke wars and other such things are just not helpful.
Before bringing the session to a close, we have time for about 2 more questions. I saw a couple of hands up in the back. So perhaps the gentleman with the green shirt.
Thank you. I'm Matthias Zedroketa from Geopolitics. I'd like to ask about the Global South and investments. So, for instance, initiatives such as the European Union's Global Gateway, but also the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure, the results they have yielded to be generous, less than hopeful, the concrete results. So can we get it right, and how? And then maybe this more of a question for Dr. Simon. Maybe a bit of gossip, speculative gossip cannot hurt us, but clearly we see divergences and differences on how to approach China within the Commission, not just between the member states. So we see High Rep Borrell going for more, Sinatra doctrine, whereas von der Leyen is tougher on China. So any expectations or any estimation for the next Commission?
And we had one other question right in the center here.
Yes, hi. Eugene Kondratov. I'm a PhD researcher at eBay. One of the key concepts that's been talked about this evening is this issue of miscalculation. This is a question for all the panelists. If they could touch on what are the key areas that the Europeans need to understand better about China and the Americans about China, and of course vice versa as well. What does China need to understand better about the Europeans and the Americans in order to avoid the kind of miscalculation that could escalate into an international security threat? Thank you.
Right, so in answer to those 2 questions, if you could limit your answers to about 60 seconds to
Yeah, super quick.
2 minutes.
Super quickly, I'll focus on the question that was specifically addressed to me. I think the fact that there are different views within the European Commission should be no surprise to anyone. I think that's yet another manifestation of the fact that there's a wide range, and Sarah was touching on that, a wide range of views on China within Europe, more broadly, right? We saw also Macron's visit to Beijing last year, and some very significant statements that are not in line with von der Leyen, for instance, right? And the two were there at the same time. I would perhaps say that I actually see, and let's see what happens if there's a change in Washington, because it seems to me that Trump's approach on China was, this is a U.S. versus China state-on-state competition, whereas Biden's approach has been, this is not about the U.S. versus China. This is about China's undermining the global rules-based order. This is about the future of the open rules-based international order. It's about values, it's about democracy versus autocracy. And we see that narrative, and which has its problems as well, has been a lot more effective in terms of rallying Europeans behind the United States in the last 4 years. We see the U.S. pivots back to a more like, state-on-state narrative, what that does to Europe. But it seems to me that in the last 4 years, regardless of the U.S. approach, actually, we've seen a lot more convergence from a transatlantic viewpoint on China. And I think the von der Leyen question and the Germany question, and Sarah can correct me on this, but I think here what's really pushing more the needle within the German debate on China has to do with economic competition, and including in the automobile sector and so on and so forth, rather than actually U.S. pressure. And it seems like even though there are still a lot of divergences within Europe, that Europe is moving in a direction that is more U.S. friendly on China, if you will.
There is increasing and intense dissatisfaction with Xi Jinping's leadership in China. And the Chinese, like people everywhere else, love to complain about their government, and there's a wide range of views in China. But what I think the U.S. government gets wrong is that the Chinese people and the Chinese government are actually much more unified than our political rhetoric would imply. In my experience, most Chinese still support most Chinese Communist Party policies most of the time, especially when they feel attacked from the outside. What does China need to understand about the West is easy to answer. The Enlightenment. That's what China needs to understand. They don't get that yet.
I agree about that, actually. I think China also has a clouded view or a distorted view of European priorities and ways of functioning, American as well. And this may be due to the Leninist party-state logic of looking at the world very much in zero-sum terms and in trying to gain absolute security terms and seeing everyone else as out to get them or something. And this is why I think rhetoric coming from Western countries about actual, partnership and cooperation and rule of law is often not really believed. That has been my experience. That Chinese friends and interlocutors often say that's all just you're making that up, or you're using that as a weapon of information warfare. You're not actually serious about that. And this is really one big part of the equation of miscalculation. And I would also advise to look at history. This rhetoric about the rise of the East and the decline of the West maybe sounds attractive to some, but I think it is flawed. It is really, really flawed. It's a miscalculation. The reason is democratic countries air their dirty laundry. They wash their dirty laundry in public. They are very transparent of all their internal divisions and their shortcomings and their failures. And this can give the impression that these systems are almost under threat of collapse. And an autocratic country does not do the same thing. So there's a lot of rot under the surface that is never really recognized and discussed. And this can give an illusion of strength that is really not there. So this is one other aspect to miscalculation. And the next point is history. Look at World War II. It took the United States awfully long to get engaged in that war. But when they did, it made a hell of a difference. And even the so-called victory of the Soviet Union over Nazi Germany would not have happened probably in that way had it not been for immense support from the United States with Lend-Lease and all of these, weapon systems and economic support that was rendered to the Soviet Union. So if we detract all that, it might have looked different. So in that sense, democratic countries take often very long time to live up to a military threat in particular, but when they do, then the resources that they can mobilize are usually pretty large. And this may be lost on some commentators in Russia and in China, I fear, and does not really factor into their risk calculus, and that is a bad thing. That does not mean that we understand the other side very well. We need to do more about that, just like they. but I feel that we may be more aware of the unknown unknowns, to use a
Rumsfeldian phrase,
famous phrase, than the other side.
Well, thank you so much, and I am a sort of a big fan of Rumsfeldian quotes, so a very good point to end on, and I think overall it's been a very provocative discussion, so you've definitely met the challenge very, very well. Before we take our 20-minute break for coffee, I would ask you to join me in a round of applause for our three speakers. Thank you.